Okay, let's dive in. When you think about a place like Burkina Faso in West Africa, maybe your first thought is, well, a nation dealing with familiar development issues.
Right. Pretty quiet, maybe.
Exactly. But this stack of sources we're digging through today, it reveals something far more complex and, frankly, pretty surprising.
Yeah, it's not just some quiet corner. The material shows it's sitting right in the middle of a really strategic and, frankly, conflict-heavy zone.
And what jumps out immediately from these reports, it's not what you might guess, like oil or diamonds driving all the global attention and, fueling the conflict.
No, the sources are really clear on this. The real flashpoint seems to be a government that's just refusing to back down. There's this growing hunger for real sovereignty that certain powerful international players find, well, let's say disruptive.
So it's less about what's literally under the ground and more about the spirit of independence rising up.
Precisely.
Our deep dive today is pulled from quite a range of material. We've got recent reports detailing a major counterattack by the Burkina forces, which are quite telling.
And our mission here really is to cut through the standard headlines, get to the core of what's actually unfolding in Burkina Faso. What is the nature of this conflict beyond the simple labels?
Right. Who's really benefiting from all the chaos?
Exactly. And what are the hidden layers of foreign involvement? That's crucial. And maybe most importantly, how is this nation, according to this material, fighting back? On multiple fronts, it seems.
So we're aiming to pull out those key insights for you, the things you can take away quickly.
Let's start with understanding the insurgency. The sources describe these armed groups active since around 2015, and they're not just scattered warlords.
No, not at all. They're painted as these well-connected transnational militias moving with almost military precision.
And definitely not lightly armed. The material details some significant capabilities crossing borders pretty easily, using encrypted Western apps for communication.
Encrypted Western apps, interesting.
Yeah. And possessing advanced foreign-made weapons, which immediately raises a huge question the sources grapple with. How? How did they get so organized, so well-equipped? Where are these fighters actually coming from?
And this is where it gets, well, really interesting. The sources connect this rise directly to the vacuum left by previous foreign interventions. Operation Barkhane, the French-led one, gets mentioned specifically.
And ironically, maybe, also the presence of certain peacekeeping efforts seems to correlate.
It's a paradox the reports highlight, isn't it? The more counterinsurgency missions seem to be active,
the more the violence seemed to spread. More insurgent strongholds popped up, often in areas where foreign forces had previously been operating. Think Mali, Niger.
So the idea that these operations were purely about stopping the violence, it doesn't quite fit the pattern described in the sources?
Not perfectly, no. And the pattern apparently became even starker after some Western forces were asked to leave. The violence didn't just ramp up, it became much more targeted, more vicious almost, specifically aimed at the new leadership, like Captain Ibrahim Traoré's government.
Which, as the sources note, forces you to ask, is this just coincidence? Or is it a consequence?
That's the unavoidable question they pose.
Okay, shifting gears a bit. Who, according to these sources, is actually benefiting from all this sustained chaos?
Yeah, the material really challenges the easy answers, like, oh, it's just about grabbing resources.
Right, like oil or minerals.
Instead, it argues the real threat, the thing that worries powerful global actors, is this concept of resistance, of genuine sovereignty actually taking root.
So Burkina Faso's potential wealth is mentioned, but it's framed strategically. Things like gold reserves, yes, but also untapped energy, agricultural potential.
And crucially, that growing desire for real independence. That's framed as the actual danger to certain external interests.
And keeping things chaotic serves multiple purposes, the reports suggest.
Absolutely. It generates those dramatic humanitarian headlines, right? Which can then be used to justify calls for external intervention.
Okay. Plausible deniability.
It also exhausts local leadership, keeps them off balance, maybe more pliable, and of course, it provides excellent cover for proxy actors, shadow forces operating in the region.
So who are the specific beneficiaries named?
Well, the sources point fingers at a few groups. Foreign mining companies, maybe wanting cheaper access to gold, arms dealers, obviously, who thrive on conflict.
A ready market.
And governments, perhaps, that are wary of a rising Africa. An Africa that stops, begging for aid and starts charting its own course.
Which leads us right into these layers of foreign interference, what some sources call the same old game of arming rebels.
Yeah, there are intelligence reports cited in the material that paint a pretty concerning picture. Warnings about external entities arming and funding what initially looked like moderate rebel groups.
Only for them to predictably morph into full-blown insurgencies later on.
Exactly. It's a pattern the sources call a repeating trick, something apparently seen in Afghanistan, Syria, Libya.
You arm a group, train them, then act surprised when they become part of the problem you supposedly came to fix.
That's the dynamic described. But Burkina Faso, the material suggests, is actively trying not to follow that script.
Unlike states that maybe welcomed foreign troops, gave up some autonomy for promises of stability.
Right. Traore's government, according to these sources, is challenging that narrative directly. They're not just asking for help, they're asking really fundamental questions.
Which the sources lay out, like, who are these fighters really? Where did they get these sophisticated weapons?
And who keeps funding them while, the Burkinabe people are struggling with basic needs?
The argument in the sources, then, is that this stance is why Burkina Faso isn't just fighting insurgents. It's being punished on multiple levels for daring to think independently, for refusing to be a client state.
Which brings us to Captain Ibrahim Traoré himself. His background, as described, isn't the usual elite path.
No palace or fancy academy. He came directly from the front lines. His rise is portrayed as, urgent, driven by anger, by seeing his country bleed firsthand.
And the reports contrast how global media initially saw him, just a young captain, with how many Burkinabe citizens reportedly viewed him.
As a leader who actually listened, sat on the ground with villagers in war zones.
Yeah, stark contrast to perhaps more distant leaders they'd known. And the sources emphasize how quickly he moved to dismantle what they call the old formula.
That cycle of permanent instability under foreign care.
Exactly. His first big move, framed as a clean break, was ending military cooperation with France, after nearly a decade of intervention that the sources characterized as, ineffective.
And the stated reason reported was that France seemed more focused on its own interests than Burkina Faso's security.
That was the claim reported, yes. And the ripple effect, according to the material, was immediate. Severed intelligence ties, training programs halted, international aid paused.
And a noticeable shift in the Western media narrative, portraying him as a threat to democracy.
Right. The sources juxtapose that with the observation that, for many on the ground, the previous democracy hadn't actually stopped the bullets or protected their homes.
Then came the second controversial move, inviting Russian military instructors.
Highly debated, yes. The sources tend to interpret this less through a Cold War lens and more as a pragmatic assertion of sovereignty.
Looking for partners willing to respect that independence, military pragmatism without the colonial baggage or IMF strings.
That's the interpretation offered. But the sources definitely acknowledge the risks involved. This shift, while asserting independence, did create a vacuum,
which allowed regrouped insurgent cells to launch a surge of more surgical, targeted attacks.
Attacks the material suggests were maybe a form of punishment for the new regime's choices.
So how did Traoré counter this, according to the reports?
With a strong push to reinforce local defense militias, improving supply lines, launching aggressive offensives. These reportedly led to hundreds of insurgents captured or killed.
And the affiliations and equipment found pointed towards foreign sponsorship.
That's what the sources claim, yes. Adding another layer of complexity. And there's a clear difference in perception noted.
Western critics calling the methods extreme.
While many in Africa, according to the material, saw it as clarity in action after years of approaches that seemed ineffective.
Okay, now the sources shift to a different kind of threat. Not guns on the battlefield, but influence, whispers, discontent. The word coup starts appearing.
Yeah, the tactic described is turning the army against its own leader, undermining from within.
And this internal threat apparently materialized early in 2025, forming inside the military structure itself.
A betrayal planned while the government was focused on fighting the external insurgency. The plotters are identified in the reports.
Disgruntled soldiers, officers, intelligence defectors.
Some of those, yes. Reportedly coordinating with insurgent factions, particularly those who'd recently lost territory. And their goal, as stated in the sources, realignment.
Back to the old order. Back to foreign handlers.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
Framed in the sources as a counter-revolution.
And the planned stages were pretty specific, weren't they?
Chillingly so, according to the material. Isolate Traoré, politically using rumors. Destabilize frontline morale with disinformation. Trigger unrest in the capital. Stage an internal mutiny. Seize the residents.
And then call for international stabilization to bring in a Western-approved transitional council.
That was the alleged plan. But what's striking, according to the sources, is why it failed.
Traore knew it was coming.
Security reports cited suggest exactly that. The key evidence highlighted was intercepted communications, specifically mentioning foreign consular codes.
Which the sources strongly suggest indicates involvement from state-level actors outside Burkina Faso.
That's the implication drawn. Traore's response, as described, was decisive, but also initially very low profile.
He let the plot develop just enough to see who was involved.
Apparently. Then moved swiftly, silently, to neutralize the network. Arrests, discovery of hidden arms, foreign cash. The coup was crushed, the reports say, in silence, before most people even knew the full extent of the threat.
The fallout must have been significant.
Huge, according to the reports. The investigation reportedly uncovered plotters working through foreign intermediaries linked to intelligence operations in neighboring countries, trying to create a path for external forces to re-enter, but through an internal takeover this time.
So, post-coup attempt, what actions did the government take?
Tightened command structures, internal loyalty audits in the military, restructured units, and according to the material, dismissed officials found with unexplained wealth.
And this led to the development of what the sources call a people-powered security model.
Yes, deploying community-based intelligence, basically trusted civilians reporting suspicious military activity. A decentralized system that, the sources note, would be incredibly hard for any foreign blueprint to replicate or easily infiltrate.
A sobering lesson learned then, according to these reports. Sovereignty isn't just threatened by invasion, but by sophisticated infiltration.
Forcing the nation into a war on two fronts, external insurgency and internal betrayal. Very complex.
Now let's move to perhaps the most sensitive area described, the villages, where ethnic tensions are reportedly being weaponized.
This is incredibly dangerous ground. A major focus here is the Fulani community, a large nomadic group across West Africa. Millions in Burkina Faso alone.
Traditionally herders, farmers, but now facing dangerous stereotyping, the material says.
The sources try to unpack the complex reasons why some Fulani individuals might join insurgent cells. Poverty, marginalization, lack of education, livelihoods eroding due to climate change or land disputes.
Makes young men vulnerable to radical narratives, especially since some jihadist leaders are also Fulani.
That's the dynamic described, which unfortunately the sources say led some within the security apparatus to fall into this devastatingly simple, dangerous stereotype. Fulani equals insurgent.
But the material acknowledges the gray areas too. Some villages forced into complicity, soldiers reacting out of vengeance.
It does acknowledge that complexity. Villages providing food or shelter under duress, soldiers losing comrades near certain areas. Yeah. It fuels suspicion, understandably, but dangerously.
But the sources stress, and this seems crucial, the vast majority of Fulani are innocent, trapped between insurgents and state suspicion.
Absolutely critical point. The sources argue every mistaken raid, every abuse that disproportionately hits innocent Fulani doesn't weaken the insurgency. It strengthens their recruitment pitch. See, they hate you. We're your only protection.
So this weaponization of ethnicity is presented as a deliberate strategic tool.
Yes.
Yeah.
Designed to fracture national unity, makes independence impossible, makes the country easier to manipulate from outside, alienate the Fulani, you get more recruits, prolong the conflict, create the conditions for foreign forces to say, look, we need to intervene for peacekeeping.
Yet amidst this, the sources highlight something positive, a remarkable happening.
Yeah, local Fulani leaders actively speaking out against the insurgents using their name, holding peace dialogues, organizing state-loyal defense groups, helping identify foreign operatives.
And some former fighters returning through reintegration programs, trading intel for amnesty.
That's also mentioned. So the sources contrasts this internal struggle, Burkina Faso, clawing its way towards unity under fire with maybe simpler international narratives. It's a hugely difficult balancing act.
And there seems to be a commitment noted from Traore's administration to build a future where being Fulani isn't cause for fear, rebuilding trust.
The material suggests that commitment is there. Acknowledging it requires immense effort, given the history and current pressures.
Okay, so pulling all these threads together from the material, the picture is stark. Burkina Faso's crisis isn't just about insurgents.
No, it's presented as this multifaceted struggle against external interference, internal sabotage, and global narratives trying to undermine its sovereignty.
And the intense scrutiny the country is under, accusations of human rights violations, authoritarianism, just for fighting back or stopping a coup. It raises that critical question from the sources.
Why is the country defending itself suddenly the one on trial?
And the sources offer a pretty pointed answer, don't they? It's not necessarily what Burkina Faso is doing wrong.
but what it might be doing right by the standards of African sovereignty, refusing to be just a compliant client state.
Look at the actions highlighted. Rejected French military presence, exposed limits of Western peacekeeping, turning to non-Western alliances, trying to use resources for domestic revival, not just export.
Stuff that the material suggests isn't supposed to happen in the heart of the former French sphere of influence.
So the scrutiny isn't really about democracy, the sources argue, but about disruption.
Disruption of the old illusion, perhaps, that African nations need foreign guidance. Restoring democracy becomes a convenient phrase, potentially, to justify interventions like we saw elsewhere.
But Burkina Faso isn't just reacting defensively, it's building a counter playbook with neighbors. The alliance of Sahel states, AES, with Mali and Niger.
Yes, the sources highlight this. Framed as a bold, trilateral defense pact, rejecting neo-colonial meddling, prioritizing regional autonomy, local solutions, an African firewall, as one source puts it.
And it's having some effect on the ground, making it harder for insurgents, disrupting routes, shifting morale.
The report suggests it's starting to. Villagers beginning to trust maybe the government can protect them. But it's fragile.
Immensely fragile, because this break comes with huge economic pressure, right? Sanctions, financial isolation, media warfare, aid cuts, World Bank packages paused over institutional concerns.
Exactly. And this pressure, the sources argue, reveals a really unsettling truth, potentially, that insurgency in this context might be politically tolerable to some global actors. But genuine independence, that's not.
So a leader who cooperates and fails is tolerated, but one who defends his people without permission gets labeled a warlord.
That's the stark contrast drawn in the analysis, that Burkina Faso is treated harsher for killing insurgents than others might be for hosting them, because the core issue, from this perspective, is control, not just security or morality.
Yet against these odds, the sources say Burkina Faso keeps defying expectations.
Investing in local military production, partnering with new global players outside the usual structures, trying to forge this new political culture army, civilians, traditional leaders, working together in survival mode.
Messy, raw, but entirely African, as the reports describe it.
And maybe what really worries some international powers, according to this material, is the example it sets.
If a small nation like Burkina Faso can navigate all this insurgency, coups, ethnic tensions, sanctions, and still chart its own path,
what excuse does that leave for others? The sources frame it as a potential political revolution hiding in plain sight.
Ultimately, the reports suggest this whole situation forces a global question. Are we going to support African nations striving for real independence? Or attack it, maybe under the banner of fighting the very insurgencies that external interests might, in part, be fueling?
So, yeah, that paints a really complex, really challenging picture based on the sources we've looked at today. Burkina Faso's fight is clearly way more than just tackling militants.
It's this multi-layered battle, foreign interference, internal betrayal, global narratives, all trying to undermine its push for sovereignty.
And the material really does highlight that distinct path being attempted under Captain Traore and how significant the AES alliance is as a challenge to the old ways.
So given everything we've discussed from these sources, how terms like stability or democracy can clearly be used in these bigger geopolitical games, how does that change the way you, listening, might evaluate those terms when they're applied to African nations trying to find their own way?
Yeah, what does Burkina Faso's fight, as described here, really tell us about the practical, on-the-ground challenges of achieving genuine independence in our world today? Definitely something to think about.